those that are joining us today. We have Maegan Johnson with DeMenna Public Affairs, the right hand of Ryan DeMenna, our duo of CPA representation down at the Arizona legislature. Technically, session is over, but technically it's not. So this might be the last legislative scoop, but there's still the opportunity for the legislature to potentially do something. Do you want to give us some context on what's behind that?
Absolutely. We say frequently that there is no lack of entertainment when it comes to Arizona policymaking. And this session was certainly no exception. We have a budget for fiscal 24 in place. The majority of bills, if not all the bills that lawmakers want to act on, have been acted on, and we remain in session. A little bizarre because as those who pay close attention to Arizona politics know that in a given legislative session, really the only constitutional obligation that our policymakers have is to enact a budget for the coming fiscal year. So that's behind us. The bills are done. Typically that budget has to be in place, of course, by July 1. And so July 1 has always been seen as sort of this line in the sand. It's the end of the legislative session. You cannot go beyond July 1. And usually by July 1, they sine die, which is the term at the Capitol for adjourning for the year, adjourning without a date certain. So at this point, lawmakers took about a month off, came back to the legislature earlier this week and voted on a flurry of bills on Monday and Tuesday, and then adjourned until July 31st. I have to tell you, it was an absolute first for me. We all know that, we work closely with my father, Kevin DeMenna, who's been doing this. I think his first session was 1979. This is a first for him as well. The reason for that, at least what policymakers are telling us, is that the Senate, which is often referred to as the upper chamber, would like to vet Governor Hobbs's nominees to lead Arizona's various state agencies. And they'd like to remain in session to do that. I think at this point, and Maegan and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but only about 3 of her nominees have made it through the process and actually been appointed. And of Arizona's major state agencies, there's about 28 of them. That means there are a lot of nominations to be vetted. They want to remain in session to do this, but I think, Maegan, if you've got the stats in front of you, this would make this the longest legislative session in Arizona's history. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's correct. If they come back July 31st and adjourn on July 31st, that would make it 204 days in session. Second to that is 173 days, and that was in 1988. But during that political climate, former Governor Maegan was impeached. Rose Mofford came on as Secretary of State. She became the new governor. So you could just imagine that would cause a longer session. So that was given, but this is just unprecedented.
And you said unprecedented because, with an impeachment of a governor and all that, there's at least a reason to stick around, right? And you mentioned they went on this session, they've gone on at least a month-long break, but they had shorter recesses earlier on, and now this one is going to be about a month and a half. So the longest session in our state's history, but a pretty big asterisk next to that, because days of them actually at the Capitol doing things, I don't even know if I would say it's going to be half of that total number. It feels like it's less when you look at attendance.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because, John, Maegan, we always talk about how the legislature, you are legislating, there's policy making going on year round. It's really just that you start voting in January. And then again, as we said earlier, by the time the budget's done, by the time the bills have been voted on, they call it a year. In this case, they're not doing that. So that's not to say that between now and July 31st, policymakers won't be meeting Capitol. I know we'll be down there plenty, talking with constituents, doing what they do as policymakers. Now, that's not all of them, but in terms of actually formally coming to the floor and conducting business as a body, that's just not going to happen. And Maegan, I got to ask you, I think if you have it in front of you, what is, for as long as we've been tracking this, what's the average length of a legislative session?
Average is about 128 days.
Wow.
But we do have a couple of noteworthy, times of history that kind of skew the numbers. You have AZ scam, Maegan, as I mentioned, COVID, and then now this year,
Well, and I will never forget, John, I think Ducey's first year in office. So it was a 84-day session, I want to say.
It sounds right.
81.
81, wow.
He even said in his inaugural, this is my goal, is to pass a structurally balanced budget expeditiously. And he did that. To now, that's the shortest session that we have.
And so I think that folks have been reporting on the fact that of this nice long break that they're going to be having, I think they'll be collecting north of $400,000 in per diem as well.
For the collective.
Right.
Yeah,
not for individual policy.
And interesting enough, I just saw new numbers for the Capital Times did in the entire year projection, including per diem and salary. Lawmakers, if they adjourn on July 31st, would have accumulated collectively $3.78 million.
We talk about, Ryan, they're legislating all year round, but they're not necessarily on the floor in committees doing those votes. And to Maegan's point, for those who might not be aware, there's a per diem that they get for 120 days. That cuts in half, as either a carrot or a stick, depending on how you look at it, to get them to adjourn session. And we just had Senator Steve Kaiser announce that he's going to be resigning his Senate seat effective today to focus on his family. But we know that he and others find it difficult to have a full-time job and essentially be a full-time legislator with only a part-time pay. So I'm curious, Maegan and Ryan, your thoughts. Does this year's exercise, drawing it out until August, the fact that they can collect that money per diem wise at least, does that change the dialogue about a full-time legislature, or at least a year-round legislature in Arizona?
I mean, I think it certainly puts more of a spotlight on it. The fact that they didn't adjourn basically when their business had been completed. It's worth noting, for example, the Senate saying they'd like to continue to vet Governor Hobbs's nominees. Nominees are able to serve for a year without being confirmed by the Senate. So they could adjourn for the year, do sort of the vetting process throughout the interim, come back and early in the next legislative session, the 2024 legislative session, finalize those confirmations. But, to your point, John, it's called a citizens legislature, and I think that if you think back to the early 1900s, we envisioned a legislature where, you leave the plow in the field, you come down, do some policy making, and when you're done with that policy making, you return to plow in the field. We know that if you want to be an effective policymaker, it's a full-time gig. And to your point, for example, the resignation of Senator Steve Kaiser, saying I'd like to prioritize time with my family. I think that really is the realities of being a full-time legislator sort of crashing down on you. It's worth noting, for example, Senator Kaiser spent the vast majority of the last interim traveling around the state and talking with stakeholders about his housing legislation, for example. So Mr. Kaiser is a good example of a policymaker who, even though they weren't in session and on the floor or in committee and voting, he was still out there trying to develop his proposals so that they were ready for prime time when they gavelled it in January. The reason that the audience is being blessed with the three of us today as well is, interestingly enough, our guest was Senator Steve Kaiser. And in the wake of his announcement, this is the day that he's formally going to resign his seat. They frequently hear us say that politics is chess in an earthquake. And so Senator Kaiser is the most recent chess piece to sort of move on the board. And so, John, I was going to ask, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about some of the other pieces that have moved throughout the session?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting session for sure. Obviously, the society is always really engaged at the legislature, and hopefully it's a little less chaotic next year. Some of the successes that we've had were, income tax conformity, something that is an annual exercise. This year didn't have a large dollar amount to it because there was little action federally, but it's still, with almost half the legislature being new, educating these new policymakers on what that is. Earliest it was signed, if you don't count, I think 2017, in about a decade, and it was the second bill signed by Governor Hobbs this year and of her administration. And I think we were only beat out for the first bill because they decided to do it numerically, the first two bills she got. We just happened to be a higher number. So, I'll put an asterisk in my mind about us being the second bill. Interestingly, this year, we also had the Board of Accountancy continuation. Part of the process for any Arizona state agency, especially ones that regulate or oversee folks have to go through a sunset process, which is being reviewed by the legislature. Do you still need to exist? Sing for your supper. Why do you need to be in existence? And so, as the organization representing CPAs, very much invested in making sure that the Board of Accountancy exists, so that the CPA credential in Arizona is there, and that the business is open for CPAs, and of course that the public is protected by having qualified and competent CPAs and source of recourse should there be any issues. It was not an easy and perfunctory process as it has been in the past, but we did make it through, and that bill got signed. I believe it was early April that legislation was enacted, and so pretty good year overall for our legislative priorities. Of course, sparse in between that, we had the CPA Day at the Capitol, which was a great opportunity for our members to go down there and talk about those two bills, but also just the profession's general insights and how we can be a resource. We had an offer from State Treasurer Kimberly Yee to come by and see the Treasurer's office, talk about 529 plans. And she even showed us the State Treasurer's training floor, which an interesting sight for sure. But to your point, Ryan, chest in an earthquake, two things that are normally very perfunctory for us: conformity and a board continuation. Not so much this year, just changing political climate, divided government, and then a whole host of new lawmakers who are just learning as they go and need to be introduced to these topics. And definitely an interesting year, but one I think that society can mark as a victorious one. And before we move on, we got a question from Patricia. What is the per diem rate? And I believe, Maegan, you're the numbers person. You might know this off the top of your head.
Maricopa and rural lawmakers make a different per diem as of in the last few years. That was changed, that rural makers made more than Maricopa. So Maricopa is at $35 a day, but then after 120 days, which is kind of not so, it's self-imposed deadline of when they should wrap up session, that per diem drops to $10 a day. And then the rural lawmakers make $238 a day. After 120 days, they make $119 a day. I guess kind of just to put that into perspective, you have 55 lawmakers that are Maricopa and then 35 lawmakers that are rural.
There's also mileage included in that, for schlepping to and from the Capitol. And it's a higher rate for those that don't live in Maricopa County.
Take care. If you're a policymaker from Window Rock, you're spending a lot of time on the road. So, and John, I do have to double down on the society's successes this legislative session, because basically half of the legislature was brand new to the process. And as we've said frequently, that doesn't mean I have trouble sort of navigating getting a bill to the governor's desk. It's that you don't know who your assistant is. You've never been in your office. You don't know where to park. You don't know where to get a cup of coffee. So it's a very steep learning curve. You couple that with the fact that Team Ducey termed out, they're done. Bring in Team Hobbs, and Team Hobbs's timeline for sort of moving into the governor's office is extraordinarily short. If you think about the general election, which wraps up in November, the results are canvassed and finalized. I think that occurred in December. And once that occurs, she has to assemble her team. She has to start identifying who will lead various state agencies. She has to hire her staff. She has to prepare a state of the state and her policymaking goals, which will be rolled out the second week in January. And then after that, she has to release her executive budget proposal. So it's just this Herculean lift in an extraordinarily short amount of time, which I've frequently heard referred to as flying and building an airplane at the same time. In all of this sort of chaos, you have, for example, conformity. And conformity, being the second bill signed by the governor, is noteworthy in my mind for two reasons. One, we worked amongst all of these newbies, and I mean that respectfully, to explain the importance of conformity and why it needs to be enacted as far in advance of tax day legislatively possible. And in order to accomplish that this year, we did what's called a bill swap. And that's where we were able to engineer that you had identical versions of conformity, one advancing through the Senate, the other advancing through the House. And then at a certain stage in the legislative process, you're able to basically swap one for the other and send that version up to the governor. And that means you get to bypass that entire route through the other chamber. Now, that's not to say you're basically doing twice the amount of work in half the amount of time, but we're very pleased that we were able to get it done so early in the legislative session. The other, and this is a little tongue in cheek, is that the governor signed it because right now she's vetoing a lot of bills. I think, Megan, I'm going to put you on the spot again, but what's our veto count right now?
We're at 111, but that's not counting any of the bills that were sent to her this week.
Right. So we expect that number to grow. And I think it's noteworthy that 111 in her first year of office is more bills than Governor Ducey vetoed in the entire 8 years that he was in office.
Mhm.
So I also believe that Governor Napolitano, the last time we had divided government, she's blown through that record in 1 year. So anyway, so getting a bill signed, that happens at a premium in this environment.
The timeline that Governor Hobbs had, and there's new legislators, but I think it's also noteworthy. Not only did she have to hire that new staff, there's been staff changes at the most senior levels for her. There was also staff turnover in the House and the Senate on both Republican and Democratic staff policy wise. And then we've already had 2 effective resignations, 1 pending resignation, and an expulsion. So all things considered, it's still a very tumultuous environment that we're in. And 1 change of leadership in the Senate on the Democratic side, soon to be change in leadership on the House side. So things are just constantly changing, and trying to keep people focused, but also aware of what's going on, and making sure that they're advancing legislation and operating in this climate is difficult, to say the least.
Absolutely. And these aren't, what they call rank and file legislators. Some of these resignations are some pretty high level positions within the legislature. For example, you had Senator Raquel Teran resign fairly early in the legislative session, and that was to run for Congress. She was replaced by Senator Mitzi Epstein. What is it? Don't change horses midstream. Well, they had to. On the House side, you have Representative Andres Cano, who will be resigning. I think that's effective.
I thought his last day was Tuesday when they.
Is that right? Okay. So the House minority will need to find a new leadership team as well. These are lawmakers who have what we call a little depth on the bench, because again, there are a lot of newbies, and they rely heavily on the more senior policymakers to kind of help guide them through the process. Yeah. So that makes it really difficult, I think, especially when you look at legislative Democrats who have a greater sort of voice and more seats at the table than ever, because they also have Governor Hobbs in the executive tower. One piece as well is, again, the importance of continuing the Board of Accountancy. And I don't think that's something that should be overlooked, because there's really 2 things at play here. One is the CPA profession has been so far ahead of the curve in terms of what we call, mobility and reciprocity. Your CPA certification, we like to say, John, that's your driver's license, right? You're able to practice in other states that have substantially equivalent rules and regulations for certified public accountants. If the Arizona board were not continued, we would fall out of substantial equivalency, meaning that Arizona CPAs are now in an extraordinary disadvantage when competing with their out-of-state. It speaks to how well run the accountancy board is. John, will you talk just a little bit about the sunset process and what it means to have the Auditor General come knock on your door versus performing a self-review?
It's something that's done every year. They have different schedules for, obviously, the state agency. Ryan, back in your early days, things were being continued for 10 years. That has gone down to the norm being 8, but essentially you're identified as coming up from your previous reauthorization, that you're going to be subject to a sunset review. The Joint Legislative Audit Committee works with the Auditor General's office to determine which state agencies, boards, and commissions will receive a full Auditor General audit that will take anywhere from a year to 2 years. So they're in year 6, essentially being identified to come up on that 8th year to work in that window of time, versus what's called a self-review, which is there are 13 required questions in statute for any state agency, board, or commission. And then there were 2 kind of sub-questions added on during the universal licensing and sunset review process a couple of years ago. So about 15 questions total that the state agency has to answer in lieu of being audited. The State Board of Accountancy being relatively small in terms of the size of state government, and the fact that the board only oversees CPAs, not the accounting profession at large, they were identified as a self-review candidate. And so just a lot of confusion among these new lawmakers, and even some returning who in years past didn't pay attention to the sunset review process very closely, thinking that somehow the Board of Accountancy had avoided governmental oversight by being assigned a self-review. And, the board submitted about 67 pages total in their sunset review report, answering all the questions thoroughly and in depth. But people just had this conception when you have the Department of Liquor going through the sunset review process as well. And the Auditor General has noted deficiencies and money in a safe that's not accounted for and other things like that. Lawmakers start to think, well, what's going on at these other self-review agencies? And so on our part, it was reminding lawmakers that they're still the ones in charge. They have legislative oversight. At any point, they can direct the Auditor General to do a little more digging or conduct audits of any kind. So in 8 years, when the Board of Accountancy goes up again, we'll for sure be requesting a full Auditor General audit just to ease everybody's concerns. But really, that's based on, does the public have any complaints? Are there things that rise to the top for an Auditor General full audit? And the State Board of Accountancy was just deemed not to hit that level. And there were other larger entities as well. I think the State Retirement System, I think the Department of Military and Emergency Affairs, those were also self-review. So it's not uncommon. That was definitely a major point of contention for a lot of those lawmakers, that they didn't have an audit. And we just had to kind of chuckle amongst ourselves because it's CPAs. We'd welcome an audit. but you, the legislature, deemed not to do that. So, and I think it's also noteworthy because there were agencies like the School for the Deaf and Blind. I think they got 4 years.
Right.
Continued despite having no deficiencies and no issues. Board of Liquor, License Control, I think that was also 4 years. So the fact that we made it through the process, Ryan, as you said, got signed into law for an 8-year continuation, but just the fact that we got the board continued for 8 years when so many others were getting 6 and 4, and some were even talking about 2, is significant in this political environment. Absolutely.
And that, again, it was just, hey, we are not one of the problem children sort of boards and commissions or state agencies. There are no concerns, no questions, no complaints. That's why we were asked to perform the self-review. And there was this perception of sort of fox guarding the hen house. And it said, to your point, we're CPAs, we welcome an audit. Bring it.
Yeah. In the last couple of minutes here, session is technically over, but they're waiting to adjourn until the July 31st. We know affordable housing and the Prop 400 extension are still the big issues kind of looming. What do you both think will happen in this, month and a half / the rest of the year for the legislature? Any special sessions?
So I think that with respect to Prop 400, so much of that is still so up in the air. You have local municipalities not pleased with the plan that was advanced by legislative leaders. The governor's indicated that she's going to veto the proposal that was sent. You have local mayors talking about going directly to the voters on that question. So I think that's not the last we've heard of Prop 400. I also don't think it's the last we've heard of the housing issue as well. We effectively haven't done anything to address it in the wake of those bills going down. But if you think about it, there was a compromise that was eventually reached between, at the time, Senator Steve Kaiser and the League of Cities and Towns. And so I think with that, you have at least a skeletal structure in terms of how you might be able to approach that issue in the coming legislative session. The thing that I'll be looking out for is how the budget will be done in the next legislative session, because as we've discussed in previous legislative scoops, the one-time money surplus is what allowed lawmakers to sort of identify priorities for their individual districts. And from there, you were able to gain the support and sort of put together the budget that we have in place now. But we have updated revenue estimates from the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, which says, I think that we're looking at an $8 million surplus in the coming fiscal year, which means effectively there isn't a surplus when taken in the context of the complete state budget. How lawmakers and the governor negotiate the next state budget is, that's a pop your popcorn moment.
I mean, I definitely think there's going to be it's going to have to be some compromise with Prop 400 and housing. I just think taking this long break, lawmakers are going to get bored and they're going to want to do something. And coming back on July 31st, I don't think we've seen the end of it. As Ryan said, they're going to be having stakeholder meetings, they're going to be negotiating. I really think we're going to see something when they come back on July 31st.
All right, well, that marks our time. Thank you, Ryan and Megan, for joining me on this last legislative scoop. Of course, for all of your work representing the society down at the legislature and for all the work you do for CPAs in Arizona. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to represent the society down at the Capitol. We look forward to the next session.
This episode of the ASCPA podcast originally aired as part of the Legislative Scoop webinar series. To learn more about the Arizona Society of CPAs advocacy efforts, visit ascpa.com/advocacy or learn more in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and review.